with really great pleasure that I chair this first of what will hopefully be several of these types of events made possible or made mandatory, of course, by that dreaded pandemic. But it does allow us to develop a kind of, or to maintain a kind of sense of community, and I think that was certainly the case during our conference in November. I'm delighted, of course, that Nuraan will now finally be able to present a paper, not the paper that she would have presented in November, which was torpedoed by a power failure in the Western Cape, but a different paper. And what I think the idea is for Nuraan to present for 20-25 minutes. After that, Paul Smeyers will offer a response, and that will of about 10 minutes. And that should leave us about 25 minutes or so for general discussion. Nuraan, just to introduce you very quickly, is a full professor at the University of Stellanbosch in South Africa. Nuraan specializes in democratic citizenship education, philosophy of higher education, Islamic philosophy of education, and gender studies. Nuraan, we're very pleased to be able to host you in this context. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kai, for your very warm introduction. And thank you for inviting me, and my apology again for the havoc of the INPE conference, but I think we're all living in very uncertain times and we'll just go with the flow. And then, of course, thank you to Paul for reading my paper. I really look forward to his response. This is the kind of conversation that Paul and I have had before, and so I'm keen to see whether I've managed to sway him as yet. So we'll find out soon enough. So I'm going to share my screen with you. The host says disabled. Kai, are you the host? Are you able to allow me to share my screen?
I will. Sorry, I will make
Thanks. Thanks, Juliette. Okay, so I trust you can all see it. So the paper is entitled Academic Freedom and the Fallacy of a Post-Truth Era. And really, this has been an extension of work that I've done previously on freedom of speech and particularly hate speech. And just also in response to very particular experiences that I've had in my own university space. And I really look forward to getting some good feedback on this, because this is a working paper at the moment. And so really where this paper comes from is the way, particularly in the Trump era, I think it just became a lot more foregrounded, is the way the idea of truth has become something that is open to negotiation. It's become a theoretical concept rather than this is it and this it is not. And it seems to be that the more we kind of negotiate around the construction of truth, the more problematic it has become in terms of what is truth, and our ideas or arguments for living in a post-truth era. Is that supposed to be some sort of collapsing of what we understand by truth? And what does it mean for us in terms of, well then, who decides and how do we arrive at understandings of truth? And for me, this has been particularly problematic in relation to academic freedom, and which of course, conceptually, theoretically, we understand as the preservation and just kind of the foundation of what constitutes a university, and the idea that there should be non-negotiations of what we're allowed to say, what texts we're allowed to prescribe, how we are allowed to teach, and then certainly the kinds of views that we quote, who gets to speak, who doesn't get to speak. And so the paper kind of stems from a growing concern that more and more there seems to be a shutting down, not only in terms of what ideas are permissible, but who actually gets to speak, and then more importantly, who decides on who gets to speak. And so for me, there are three interrelated concerns, and the one is, can conceptions of academic freedom be conditional? Should students have the freedom to impose disinvitations, thereby enacting their own freedom to act? And does the demand for safe topics outweigh the university's responsibilities in relation to a pursuit of truth? In sum, the primary question is, how can the university remain discursively open to that which is new, unfamiliar, and unpopular, while simultaneously doing no harm, either to itself or to its students? Now, of course, I think we're all very familiar with the concept of academic freedom. Much has been written on the topic. I'm particularly drawn to Derrida's work on this issue, where he's quite clear about couching academic freedom as a completely unconditional aspect of what a university ought to stand for. So in his opinion, nothing is beyond question. And in that nothing, he includes, like Giroux does, even that which is subversive, even that which is contrary to good conscience. And so the university ought to be a space not only where we challenge taken for granted ideas, and not only where we contest that which is unfamiliar and familiar to us, but it's certainly a space where we ought to be made uncomfortable occasionally. It ought to be a space where our kind of closely held notions of what the world ought to be and how we ought to see the world is challenged and bring into disrepute. And I lean on Bowman's work in this regard in terms of, we either choose a path of, as much as possible, it's very problematic to speak about objective freedom, but certainly in terms of, are we going to allow a subjective kind of freedom in terms of constraint, where we are leaning on the opinions of others in determining what is acceptable and what are we allowed to say and who is allowed to say certain things? Or are we going to enter the university space as much as possible a neutral space where competing views can come together, whether they are in conflict or not? So more and more, however, we are seeing that in as much as all universities, you're not going to find a university who's going to say academic freedom is not what we stand for. Every single university will pay homage to the concept of academic freedom and will certainly kind of affirm that it has a commitment to it. But more and more we are seeing, and surprisingly, more and more from people who would couch themselves as being on the left of politics. We are seeing a rising push where, in place of academic freedom as an intrinsic good, we are suddenly seeing censorship as a good in terms of protecting people against certain unwanted, unacceptable, threatening views, as Keenan Malik writes about. And so suddenly the given of academic freedom is slowly being eroded by this idea that there are certain kind of views, certain kinds of speech, certain kinds of people from whom we ought to be protected and from whom students ought to be protected. And then, of course, I mean, besides the external influence that comes into that, and of course we see students play a major role there, we see universities, administrators play a role there, we see politics play a role there. But of course, these kinds of regulation of what is permissible in university spaces also lives within the increasing corporatization of universities. So of course, if you have certain funders, certain kind of donors wanting you to toe a particular party line, for example, a particular philosophical line, for example, that in itself becomes a form of what I would call academic prohibition. And so we are slowly but surely on the slippery road where we are no longer understanding the university space as a natural extension of the public space. And that if the university is not going to hold on quite steadfastly to ensuring that there are spaces for dissent, that there are spaces for what is commonly referred to as controversy, if we are not going to do that, then we are kind of eroding the democratic values which ought to prevail in the public sphere. And so to a very large extent, and this is now with Derrida's argument, that it is up to the university not only to be responsive to the kind of community which it finds itself, but it certainly ought to set the bar in terms of what a democracy ought to look like. And from my understanding, a democracy by no means only dabbles in that which is agreeable, only dabbles in that which is complacent and kind of appeasing to all. A democracy by its very nature is messy, it's chaotic, it's dirty, it's ugly. And there has to be a space where that kind of messiness can be interrogated. And to me, there is no other space but for higher education to do that. Now, the flip side of this conversation obviously is, well, does the unconditionality of academic freedom equally apply to people, students, administrators, universities to shut down? So in as much as I kind of say, well, I have the right to say, does your right to say, well, no, you actually don't? And this is the kind of competing principles which the university finds itself at the crossroads that we are sitting with. So on the one hand, we have the one principle saying that a university ought to be a discursively open space. That's a non-negotiable. And on the other hand, we say, well, a university should do no harm. Now, of course, this concept of harm it's open to discussion. It's open. What's going to harm me is not going to necessarily harm the next. So it's a very kind of loose term, and we don't really have the time to go into that right now. But I think we can all kind of agree in terms of what I'm trying to get at. And so we do see controversial topics, academics, when they come out with views which are problematic to mainstream thinking or not considered left-wing enough or not considered right-wing enough, then they are portrayed as enemies of academic freedom. And so so what happens is that this word controversial or controversy has somehow become a signpost for shutting down. And it's one example that I want to focus on, and there've been many, many of these, but the one that kind of hit home, that is at home for me, happened in 2016, and we've had a big one at my own institution, which I can speak about should time permit. But in 2016, Fleming Rose, of course, some of you might know him as an editor of a newspaper who was responsible for publishing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. And some of you might know that there was a huge outcry about that amongst the Muslim community, and there was lots of kind of toing and throwing as just to how bad this person is or was, right? So UCT invites him to present the T.B. Davy Memorial Lecture, which is supposed to be the epitome of academic freedom, because that's what T.B. Davids stood for. After some kind of protests from students, certain political groups on campus, the university decided to rescind or disinvite Fleming Rose. And quite interestingly enough, the reasons that was provided by the Vice Chancellor, Max Price, at the time, was that inviting him would retard academic freedom rather than advance it. And there's been lots of papers written by Keenan Malik, for example, who had been the previous speaker just before Fleming Rose, as to just how cowardly this, and that was the word used, how cowardly this action was. UCT stood its ground and said that the safety of students would be at risk and that it was not in the interest of advancing any sort of academic thinking or advancing UCT's space as an open space by inviting him. So this kind of serves as one example of how disinvitation plays itself out. So in the competing principles of being open, as opposed to being closed to harmful speech, consideration, of course, has to be given to which of the two principles hold the greater potential for the advancement of knowledge within a democracy. And I think for me, that's the critical point here. It's not simply advancing knowledge for the sake of advancing knowledge. What happens within higher education will spill over and be reflective of what happens in the agora. You can't separate higher education as a public space from the public space of a democracy. And so engaging with views which we might find repugnant or offensive, in my opinion, that certainly does not mean that one is foregrounding or extending the potential of harm or the potential of hateful speech. It is reasonably evident that you can only change the view of a harmful or a controversial view. You can only counter it, you can only engage with it by engaging with it. So when you disinvite people, when you shut down that which you define, describe as controversial, what that does is you close off the avenue to deliberation. You close off any pathways to kind of engagement and debate. More importantly, that disinvitation implies that controversial views cannot be subjected to interrogation. That's the flip side of this. And so what that means is that certain views will continue to hold its power because it remains uninterrogated. And then the final issue for me in terms of disinvitation is that it implies that academic freedom is the domain and preserve of those who are in agreement and not of those who are in disagreement. And that for me is highly problematic. So now we have this thing called post-truth. And as I've said to you at the start of my presentation, it's got to do with how loosely we understand truth, how we wish to interpret truth. But ultimately, unless we create a space for competing multiple truths, there's not going to be a way to figure out what is actually informing what Fuller describes as the knowledge game. And so we have to, by reclaiming the university as a space which ought to construct academic freedom as an unconditional, unnegotiable space, in so doing, we recontrol the knowledge game. And we basically are saying that the knowledge game is not about shutting down. The knowledge game is not about disinviting. What it does do, and what is claimed to a post-truth era does, is to force us to make sure that we apply deeper understandings to the kinds of epistemologies which we rely upon, the kinds of science, the kinds of education. And it forces us right back to re-articulate our recommitment and responsibility to ensuring that a university remains unconditional. And so it's not just a matter of being able to discern between that which is true and not true. It's also about being unafraid to enter the conversations of what constitutes just and ethical behavior. So if we find the views or the actions of people like Fleming Rose problematic, for example, then the only way we can begin to interrogate those views is to engage with them. So in pulling this together, the moment academic freedom is provisional, the moment it is open for negotiation and restriction, it's going to dissipate. Because who decides when academic freedom applies? Who decides when disinvitation applies? Who decides who is an agreeable speaker and who does not? And so the idea of engaging with controversial voices is to create opportunities, and Judith Butler has written about this in terms of resignification, to create opportunities to speak back. I find particularly in South Africa, where there's a strong kind of climate of racism, that unless I invite students to speak to me about their racism, they simply take those views elsewhere. And so it's really important to rather allow those views to come to the fore and to the surface than to push them back down, because when they are down below the surface, then they simmer into something else. So indifference or resistance to controversial voices and truths can be likened to neglecting dissenting views. So in our efforts to shut down that which we find problematic, what we are actually saying is that we refuse to engage with views which are not similar to ours. And so the unconditional freedom has to be not only to listen, but to engage and to question. And the university has to maintain that if it is to make a meaningful contribution. And then lastly, the point I want to make is that in the university adopting an unconditional stance about academic freedom, in the university saying, we will not interfere in who gets to speak and who gets to say certain things, regardless of what the controversy is. What the university does is it defines itself as powerless in interfering in who and what kinds of voices come into that space. And the last point I want to make is that I think we do a lot more harm to those we teach when we create an unreal world of agreement, an unreal world of non-debate and non-controversy, and somehow want to present that as educational. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Nuraan, for a very topical and refreshing presentation. It gives me great pleasure now to welcome Paul Smeyers to present his response. Paul, of course, most of us know already. He's now a retired professor of education from Leuven University in Belgium, but is also a former president of INPE, but carries on, apart from his academic and intellectual work, of course, is still the editor of Ethics in Education. Welcome, Paul, and thanks very much for offering to.
Thank you. Thank you, Nuraan, for a very, very rich paper. There are many issues I think one can take up to discuss further elements. I've chosen not to go into the post-truth debate. There's a very insightful paper about that written by Kai a couple of years ago. You talk about academic freedom. Academic freedom is in the title of your paper, and you pick up a particular element of academic freedom, because it could also be about, do we have the right to appoint who we want, and various other elements. There is indeed a lot of literature about that. I will say something about an element that I think is important in academic freedom. And so I've titled my response, Whose Academy, Which Freedom? I'll read it. I give a summary first of Nuraan's position, and then try to make a few comments on a particular element that I think is the gist of the argument of what Nuraan is saying. Now, to point you already to where I will be going, I think, Nuraan, you're not talking about academic freedom, you're talking about free speech, freedom of speech. But okay, we'll see how far it goes. As a casualty of the negotiated understanding of truth, academic freedom is in a perilous state, the paper argues. Academic freedom infers that both members of staff and students at universities have the right to engage in intellectual engagement and debate without fear of censorship, and thus, in encouraging individuals to express their truth or how they see the world, others in turn might respond with their own truths. These were virtually all quotes from the paper, which, and I quote again, confirms academic freedom as an uncompromised feature of the university. Yet, so Nuraan continues, we see growing patterns of shutting down and closing off rather than opening up. Academics or speakers who are deemed as holding controversial or harmful views are routinely prevented from speaking in university spaces. This suggests, she continues, not only an intolerance of that which is disagreeable, but an abandonment of speech and freedom. Three issues are, according to the paper, interrelated: conceptions of academic freedom and whether these can be conditional, the autonomy of students, and whether the demand for safe spaces and topics outweigh the university's responsibilities in relation to critical engagement and hence truths. There is, as far as I can see, a clear answer in the paper. The unconditionality of academic freedom cannot be equally interpreted as an unconditional freedom to shut down particular ideas, arguments, or individuals. The paper claims that there are an increasing number of academics who are portrayed as the enemies of academic freedom because they teach controversial topics or prescribe unconventional texts, and the paper offers a long discussion of some examples to convince us. Incidentally, I will accept this for the sake of the argument, yet I want to note that personally, I've not seen much of this. Anyway, it is here that I get lost, or rather, confused about what is exactly criticized by the paper and how. So now I start with some comments. When one invites someone to give a talk or an address, one offers a platform to discuss a particular content. This implies that whatever the speaker's position is, one deems the content as a relevant object of study. This presupposes that arguments are offered, which in turn depend on theoretical constructions, concepts, and what are offered as facts within this framework. Even more is going on that requires our attention. Would we offer a platform to someone who continues to shout that the election result is stolen, but fails to offer evidence for this? Or to someone who denies that there were concentration camps during the Second World War? Is this a matter of freedom of speech, of academic freedom, or rather blatant nonsense, offensive and disrespectful, nothing to do with truth-seeking? Discussing evidence or scientific method requires an investigative attitude, banning the telling of lies and fallacies in reasoning. Some matters can easily be determined, such as how many people were present during the inauguration of the 45th President of the US. Other issues may require some basic understanding of chemistry and the functioning of the human body. For example, when it is suggested that people should drink chlorine dioxide to cure a COVID-19 infection, although this substance can be used in cleaning products to kill the virus on surfaces. It is doubtful that academia will want to offer a platform to speakers who hold such beliefs, and dangerous if one does, as the platform not just offers the opportunity to express certain views, but has an aura around it of justified belief or credibility, to say the least. It makes what is argued for respectable. Denying someone the platform who claims white supremacy is no ban of serious research focusing on differences between races. Studying the difference of levels of testosterone in boys and girls and what this may necessitate to how we deal with them in secondary schools is legitimate research, even if some or all of us dislike the result. That is, that there are more disciplinary problems with boys. Academic freedom requires indeed a culture of questioning and challenging one's own beliefs. It is not the same as freedom of speech. While in general freedom of speech is interpreted in very broad sense, yet not absolute, there are in many societies some restrictions as a consequence of the interplay with other universal rights. Academic freedom is much more a matter of content, facts, theories, arguments, rational or systematic procedures, etc. Moreover, there is an expectation of at least intellectual integrity of the scholar. Participating in an academic discussion is not the same as offering a floor for political propaganda, not even as an opportunity for an internal political party debate. Neither is it a therapy session where a place is given to express whatever one feels. Neither is it about spreading the word, nor about expressing one's truth in as far as this is sealed off from a shared world that is spoken of. It is about seeking the truth and at the same time accepting one's indebtedness to one's presuppositions, or more precisely, to what makes sense for us to say. Seriously, should we open up to the endless repetition of what food labels bullshit, whether or not intended to deceive, where it is not tried to get things right, and where being true to oneself is preferred above being true to the facts? Or should we, academia, be free to determine who and what we want to engage with? Though I agree that science does not operate in a vacuum, clearly there are many examples where research has addressed issues against the interests of the dominant forces in society. Let me just mention a few cases where uncomfortable truths were offered. The whole area of climate change, the use of asbestos, the so-called positive effects of alcohol, 2 glasses of wine a day, and the denial of the effects of smoking. I have focused on one aspect that is lacking from the paper, which invites us to consider a particular meaning of academic freedom, as obviously, as I already said, there are many more. The different elements that are offered by the paper distract from what, in my opinion, should be central, that is, content. At the same time, this sets limits to the choice to engage with particular speakers and texts. Time is limited. Not everything is worthy of our attention. Thus, in some cases, we, academia, should be free not to offer a platform to some speakers. Silly positions can be the object of serious study, but their proponents should be denied our floor. It can, of course, be argued that universities should organize political debates, or more generally, make their infrastructure available for general debates. That is, however, an entirely different matter, to be judged on a different basis, which obviously will include whether it is safe or not to hold such meetings. But it has nothing to do with academic freedom. I leave it to that.
Thanks very much, Paul. I think perhaps we should give Nuraan an opportunity to respond, and then I'll open the floor to further questions, comments.
Thank you, Paul. Really enjoyed your response. I immediately become alert to terms of what you describe as relevant investigative attitude, and this predetermination of what you decide is relevant and who gets to decide what's relevant. And to use your example of somebody shouting the election was rigged, do we want to listen to that person? My answer is going to be yes, I would like to listen to him, because in listening to him, I'm actually going to ask him to show the proof of what he's saying. But And in tied to that, if universities do not offer the platform, and to pick up on what you were saying, in that the university should not be offering a platform to certain views, such as claims of drinking chlorine and whatever else was said during Trump's crazy time as a leader of the free world. But if we don't offer the platform for that, then those kinds of wild remarks go to platforms anyway. And we have seen that happen incredibly on social media. And let's face it, our university bodies, our students, their primary space of engagement is social media. And the university's role, therefore, becomes almost intensified in even engaging in that which is silly, if only to reveal its silliness. I'm going to leave it at that. You've really made me alert to a lot of points, particularly the kind of discrepancy and the line which cuts between academic freedom and freedom of speech. Thank you for that. And so I really would invite Kai, with your permission, to get some more inputs, and of course Paul's. So thank you.
Great, thanks Nuraan. And yeah, now it's our opportunity to pose questions.
Okay, I have. Thank you very, very much. Yeah, I thought this was so timely. It's topical. It's so relevant, I think, to some discussions I've been having with colleagues in the university over the past couple of years. And while I'm very sympathetic to not repressing views, because then they, of course, as you say, Nuraan, they come up in other contexts anyway. There needs to be a forum through which to deal with that. And I do see that as part, perhaps, of my pedagogical practice in order to sort of discuss those issues, quite frankly, with a group of students. However, I appreciate, Paul, you know, the sort of social, the power relations embedded in an invitation by a university to come and do a talk. And that is quite different, I think, than a pedagogical task to actually engage with your students at whatever sort of levels of belief or whatever is going on. And so I'm kind of interested in one of the principles that you mentioned early on, Nuraan, didn't maybe follow through on. You said that, you know, you weren't going to go into identifying it, but it seems to me it has to do with harm. And I'm not willing for my university to invite a neo-Nazi who just wants a platform for spouting not just untruths, but hatred, and possibly, you know, inciting violence against others. That would be very different for me than a student who is struggling to articulate some racist ideologies in a classroom situation that I would know much better how to handle. And so I think that those two things are quite different, and I would want us to actually maybe make some distinctions between the sort of the academic freedom via free speech and the harm, the classroom situation, but also the issue of harm. I think that needs to be sort of all of this being weighted against. Sorry, that wasn't really a question. It was more of a long-winded comment at the moment.
Thanks. No, it's a really important comment, because the issue of harm, of course, is just such an unnavigated terrain of what we understand. But at this very moment, yesterday, for quite literally, my university expelled a student for posting Nazi posters around the university under the auspices of reclaiming the university space as an Afrikaner nationalist space. And it's been carrying on for the last 2 years, the disciplinary hearing. And finally, he lost his appeal yesterday. Now, this same student has appealed for numerous occasions. He has appealed for the right to be able to address students, to express his views. Off the bat, his views are problematic. I mean, anybody who's going to be posting Nazi posters around university, there's something problematic already, right? This is a first-year student, by the way. So he's all of 19. Now, clearly he's come out of a particular kind of socialization, a particular kind of politicization where he thinks this kind of behavior is acceptable. In expelling this young man, there's been a mixed response in terms of, okay, good, we're rid of bad person. But the person leaves with those views intact and probably more reinforced by what he now perceives as the unfair treatment of a university. And so there's that harm as well. But for me, and to come back to your earlier point of how do I use pedagogy, how do I teach, how do I see education, I have to be able to allow this young man to speak. I have to invite him into and should he be in my classroom and he has this particular view of white supremacy, as problematic as that might be for me, I have to allow him to articulate those views so that I can begin to engage with those views. And so the initial harm of listening to hateful speech or the initial harm of listening to problematic views, I think are offset by the potential outcome, if only to show this young man how problematic these views are. And so the academic freedom has, and I know Paul has kind of highlighted a clear problem here. But I do, however, find it difficult to speak about freedom of speech as entirely not academic freedom or entirely different to academic freedom. Because if we speak about freedom of speech within the public sphere, then that does get recouched as academic freedom within a university space. I mean, I do see a continuum there. And so for me, it's not about simply let's invite every crazy person onto our campus for the sake of inviting crazy people onto our campuses. But when we are presented with the craziness, we have to take that as an educational moment. And the education will only happen if we engage with that person rather than pushing that person out of the system. So, yeah.
Thanks very much, Nuraan. I've just seen Tisha has posted a very interesting comment. By not dialoguing, aren't we mirroring their hate and dismissal, which is certainly worth thinking about. Further questions, comments?
I think both me and Marit have raised our hands. Can you see that, Kai?
Oh, I'm sorry, no.
No. Okay. It's a digital thing. If you go to participants, you see it. Anyway, I think it was me and then Marit, wasn't it? Yeah. Well, I just want to say to begin with, thank you both, Nuraan and Paul, for raising this hugely important topic, and as Sharon said, very timely as well. I think I just have a comment and a question actually also, because my response would be, the question for me is not really where you ended now, Nuraan, in saying, should we allow everybody to speak or should we not? The question for me is essentially a matter of form. It's a matter of how we allow people to speak in academia. And I think Paul is onto that when he says it's about a culture of questioning and interrogation, for example, and it's a culture of where we don't, the form we are, my point is, in order to allow an opinion or some content matter, whatever, to be expressed within the academia, it has to subject itself to certain academic forms. That is, we do things in the university that are not done in the same way anywhere else. So to me, in order to be able to talk about, because I agree, I think we are talking about the freedom of speech, and the term academic freedom is used today, so I have difficulties really approaching academic freedom. But I'm thinking about, I'm more and more interested in the forms through which we work academically, and the peer review processes are immensely important. We don't share views, we don't share theories in academia, but perhaps we need to share we need to share common practice. The disputatio, for instance, is a certain form that we need to cultivate. That it's not only a culture, it is a culture of questioning and interrogation that we need to cultivate. So that for me is the essence through which we can say, okay, yes, you can come here and talk about disinfectant, the role of disinfectants or whatever, if you can drink it or not, but you have to do it in a way that can be interrogated and questioned and disputed. Anyway, so that was my comment, and that's where also my question comes from, because in the middle of your speech, you talked about the public space in the Agora, and you didn't seem to make any distinction to me between the Agora and the university or the campus. And to me, there is a huge difference. The campus is not for me a public Agora, but I'd like to hear what you think. Is there a difference to you? Or is it the same thing?
I think the university space is reflective of the Agora, and similarly the societal space picks up its cues, certainly from what happens in higher education. And so for me, it's certainly not possible to separate those two. Certainly what happens in the Agora will spill over. If we have high incidence of poverty, unemployment, violence, gender-based violence, for example, which has been a huge part of the public space at the moment, that will be reflected in higher education. And certainly what we try to do in university spaces is to adequately reflect that in terms of what kinds of citizens are we cultivating in our university spaces. And my fear is when we shut them away, or we push out ideas which we consider problematic, we might not be adequately preparing them for that Agora. So, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I agree that the what spills over, but my point was that how we approach it differs. That was, yeah.
Absolutely agree with that point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
I think. Thanks, Louisa. Thanks, Nuraan. I think we've got Marit next. So my apologies. I haven't seen any raised hands. Or...
All this digital thing, it's kind of hard to keep track of. Thanks, and thanks both for very good introductions and talk. And I think I'm wondering, or first of all, I think what you point towards for me, Nuraan, is the creating of open spaces for critical debate and the necessity for upholding those spaces. They're very necessary. But for me, what Paul pointed to is this distinction between political debate, which we see a lot of today, and I think that it has also invaded the universities, as opposed to what I understand then more as academic freedom, critical debate that Paul pointed to, with some other requirements in it towards the interrogation, the criticizing, seeking truth, knowledge base, etc. And I think here, or I would rather ask you, do you see the point in upholding this distinction? Because as I see it, the way that political debates nowadays, especially in media, and other places is evolving, is very, often lacks knowledge, lacks criticism, lacks all the things that we commonly put into the kind of critical debate that we see as important for and as part of academic freedom. And I think also this is much broader than you have pointed to, because I think this way of politicizing communication, to put it that way, in university is happening in very subtle ways, and so that you are not allowed to criticize internally in a department where you work, for instance. If you do, you will gradually be exposed or expelled as part of the community. All of those processes, and to me, that is part of what happens when things become just a political debate with you're just opposing, you're just posting a view and don't really want to go into the critical discussion.
I would really like to hear Paul's response on this as well. But what I want to say from my side, I'm interested in your distinction between critical discussions and political debate, because from where I'm sitting, every single thing we do is political. Education itself is political. Education can never be unpolitical or depolitical. Every single time we implement a policy at university, the politics is driving it. The kinds of teaching we espouse, the identities we bring into our classrooms, it's always political. And so the idea that we can discern between that which is political and that which is not, I really don't. I've never come to education in that way. I've always come to education as a highly politicized space. So I would be interested to, I mean, it's something I can definitely think about, but it's, thanks, Marit. It's probably going to prod me in a particular way once I think about this some more, but that's my gut response to that. I would be keen to hear what Paul has to say on that.
Everything is political and everything is ethical and everything is epistemological, but that is not really very helpful, is it? I mean, we want to draw distinctions, we want to go back to certain arguments, to certain positions, and what is, I think, unique in university is that it is possible to have different views on very basic assumptions. I mean, you can either embrace Newtonian physics or you can embrace Einsteinian physics, and you do that for particular reasons and to solve particular problems. But to say that everything is political to the extent that freedom of speech is the same as academic freedom is not really very helpful, I think. There is something distinctive about what we offer in a university debate, or the kind of debate we're having now where we look at arguments and presuppositions, which is not necessarily and certainly not always the case in a general political debate or in a general debate whatsoever. And you're quite right, Nuraan, that, okay, social media is a different space, but that does not necessarily mean that everything we do at the university should reflect all these elements. I mean, if you speak as an academic, I'm not saying that you are preaching the word, but there is an expectancy that you can answer justificatory questions when I ask you, why do you hold this or why do you hold that? And those elements are often missing in general debate or in political debates. They much more start from a kind of shared point of view of a political party, for instance, something we do not do at the university. So my point was, shouldn't we draw more distinctions between those two kinds of debates, so that, I mean, at least someone who listens to a university debate may legitimately expect that people will look at their presuppositions and at their arguments and at the strength or the weakness of the arguments, etc. So there's something else going on there. And I am afraid that if you would invite a proponent of white supremacy, that he's given the floor and that the aura around this, because it comes from a university debate, does more harm than good, you know? I mean, because not everyone will ask the same kind of questions. So that was my point. Shouldn't we, your title gives academic freedom. I think the paper is much more about, should there be freedom of speech at the university campus? Okay, but that is a different issue. I mean, it should not be linked necessarily with academic freedom. Academic freedom is a serious kind of thing. For instance, one aspect would be, and then I'll stop, is that as a professor, I'm entitled to research whatever I want within the area of my expertise, even if that is upsetting, such as with climate change or with the damaging effects of alcohol and of smoking, all kinds of societal interests and the interests of certain groups. So I should be free to do that. And for that, I think one justly uses the term academic freedom. What you're arguing for, and what was taken up by Sharon at the beginning of the discussion, is what do I do when I'm teaching and certain positions are aired by our students? How do I deal with that? Do I say that they have to shut down, or do I create a space for that? But that is something else, I think, than the link, making the link with academic freedom. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Paul. We've gone over time already, so perhaps this is an opportune moment to thank you for your contributions. And this is clearly a topic we could carry on with for at least another 2 hours, Nuraan. Also emphasizing on the harm issue, the truth issue, which I would have a lot to say, but perhaps, I mean, this bodes well for the many discussions we'll have in the future. So thanks very much, Nuraan. Thanks very much, Paul, for your response, and thanks all for attending.
Thank you to everybody for attending. Thanks so much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Kai.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.